Now, is that appropriate to call you an Englishman? And therefore the correct drink is a cup of tea?
A cup of tea, yes. That's right. Let's have another cup of tea. And then we go home. Right, said Fred.
Let's have a cup of tea. Right, said Fred.
Yeah, I got a kind of feeling. If we removed the ceiling, with a rope or two, we could drop the blighter through.
God, were they moving a piano upstairs or something?
Right, they were moving a piano. Yes, what was it? If we remove the handles and the things what hold the candles. But it did no good. Well, I never thought it would, so...
Right, said Fred. Well, this afternoon it's my real pleasure to be sitting next door to Ted Simon. Many of you watching this will know exactly who Ted Simon is, but for those of you who don't, Ted Simon is frequently known as the godfather of motorcycle overlanding because he was one of the very early people to travel around the world. And I have a feeling that actually you were the first one to travel all of the continents except for Antarctica. Is that right?
I don't know. I could never get to the bottom of it. I mean, I found one or two other people who had done something similar before me, but always in different ways. All I did was go around the world, take as long as I could to go around the world and see as much of it as I could, and that was all I was doing.
It was the early 1970s, wasn't it? And you ended up spending 4 years, and you were riding a Triumph Tiger.
Yes.
How many cc's was that?
That was 500.
And it wasn't particularly reliable all the time, was it?
The thing about motorcycles in England in those days was that they were mostly used by blokes who couldn't afford a car, and they'd be going to work on them, and so they would expect to be maintaining them and looking after them, because that's what kept them going. So the fact that they needed a lot of looking after wasn't considered a bad thing. But in fact, compared with more modern motorcycles, they leaked a fair amount of oil, and they had to be looked at from time to time. Yes, they did.
Now, you were a novice when you set off, weren't you?
Absolutely.
How many months?
Innocent. I hadn't been riding at all.
Right.
I had the idea of going around the world on a motorcycle before I knew anything about motorcycles. It just seemed like a very good idea, a good way to do it. I was so busy that I got the motorcycle offered to me by Triumph because I'd got support from a newspaper, from the Sunday Times, to do the trip. And I was very amused because they didn't know that I didn't even have a motorcycle license, let alone any experience at all.
Along the way, you learned to do things like strip the engine out and replace pistons and all sorts of things like that, didn't you?
Yes, well, it needs must. You know, it's amazing what you can do when you've got to do it. My first motorcycle maintenance job was in Cairo, and because there was a war on, I found that I was going to have to take the engine to pieces and do something with the pistons, and it was very hairy job because there being a war, I could get no advice, I could get no parts, everything was tied up. And I took 2 days to do what I later was able to do in 45 minutes. And it was like, you know, every move I made, I thought, oh God, this could be the end of the journey. It was like bomb disposal work. You know, I'd sort of unscrew something and stand back and think about it, and it was quite interesting. Well, that's all about me. What about you? What was the beginning of your journeys? How did that all come about?
I'd travelled a lot in various different ways. I'd hitchhiked and bicycled and sailed a little bit and so on. And at the end of a 3-year trip, I thought, actually, do you know, you ought to grow up, get yourself a career and a mortgage and a car and all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So I did exactly that, and was doing very well in my career. It was in retail management, but I got to the stage where actually I realised that I didn't like my job.
Retail management doesn't sound very exciting.
Oh, I loved it because it was dealing with people.
Yes.
It was solving customers' problems.
Oh, yeah.
When somebody walks in through a shop, they may not know it, but they want to buy something. That means they've got a problem. What do I get?
Yeah.
And helping somebody choose the right thing to suit their needs and to suit their personalities was great fun. But it all became very hardcore and hard-nosed, and over rather a lot of beers one night, I realised that I didn't have any responsibilities. I didn't owe anybody any money. My family were well. I didn't have children and I didn't have pets. And I thought, well, you know, this is so rare to have all of these things in the same place at the same time. Do something different because you may never be this free again. And during the course of the amber nectar supping, I just came up with the idea that I'd ride through Africa.
You were already a motorcyclist?
No, not at all.
Oh, you weren't?
No, not at all. The reason I chose Africa was because I was born in the Congo and I lived there until I was 10 years old. And I thought, well, if you're going to do a journey, why don't you go back and see whether your childhood memories about how things sound and smell, whether there's any reality to those. And the next morning I handed my notice in. I passed my test 6 weeks later, and 6 weeks after that I was at the edge of the Sahara thinking, Sam, you idiot, what have you done this time?
To backtrack a second, the Congo is pretty exotic to most people. I mean, is there any story? Why were you born in the Congo?
My parents were teachers there, and they'd been watching what the Belgians were doing.
Yes.
And it was pretty much genocide.
Yes.
The whole of the Congo belonged to King Leopold, and he was treating it as his private country estate. And he'd send out young men to work there for 2 to 4 years, and the young men could earn their fortune, but they became very, very hard-nosed and absolutely brutal to the local people.
I did hear that, yes.
And my parents decided that the only way the Congolese were going to survive was if they could learn how to speak French and read and write and add up. And if they had that, then they would have the skills to at least work with, if not understand, the way the Belgians were doing things. But it was a great place as a kid. I ran around in shorts and no shoes, and my parents had no idea on what I was doing most of the time. It's probably a darn good idea that they didn't.
Well, tell me more about that, how that first began, that first journey.
The journey, I'd literally been riding a motorcycle for 3 months the day I got to the edge of the Sahara Desert. And my first thought was, well, actually, I'm being really daft here. You've got no competence in this. But the problem was I told my mates in the pub that I was going to do it, so I didn't dare turn around. But I was lucky enough to link up with some other travellers. I rode with them for the first couple of months, and then we parted ways.
How did you learn to ride in the sand, by falling down a lot, or?
I had been living on the island of Jersey between France and England. And I learnt to ride going round in circles at 40 miles an hour because that's what the speed limit was. But I'd also been down onto the beach a couple of times. But of course, riding on sea salt sand is very, very different to riding on sand, isn't it? And the first sand that I rode was heading away from the ferry at Wadi Halfa up to Wadi Halfa town. And that was when I first discovered what fishtailing means. It's a very weird experience, isn't it? I actually rode the 5 miles or whatever it is without falling off, but I fell off multiple times.
What year was that when you got to Wadi Halfa?
It was 92.
92? Okay. Yes, there was a town.
Well, the original Wadi Halfa had just been flooded when they were. Yeah, that's right. When they built the Aswan Dam.
Yes, yes.
And I've seen black and white photographs of it, and palm tree-lined streets and white buildings and so on.
Me too, and I regretted never having seen it above water. But I think I also fishtailed on my way into what you call the town. Yes, I think I had the same trouble.
I remember that place being so hot that even the flies looked drunk with the heat.
Yes, yes. I'd had about 2 months to practice riding the motorcycle. That was in France, and the closest I came to sand was riding on loose gravel, and fell off there and got a liberal amount of shrapnel into my legs, which got painstakingly picked out by a friendly doctor who said, you're not going to be able to get anywhere, let alone go around the world if you're doing this kind of thing.
I remember riding across France feeling like I was some sort of motorcycling accessory attached to the bike because it was telling me what to do, and I was just hanging on the back hoping I didn't fall off. But I guess there was just this sort of inner thing of confidence. Well, you've committed to doing this thing now, so you might as well get on with it. And I do know that, I mean, this is one of my strong memories, is that every time I did something stupid on the bike, then I actually made a point of stopping and thinking about what I'd done and why it had ended up being stupid. And it was often falling off. What made me fall off? Well, actually, there was that ridge of gravel, and you shouldn't have taken it at such a slope. You should have cut across it at much more of an angle. Okay, well, I won't do that again. Those sorts of things. So most of it was just common sense by mistake.
Yes, that was very much the same for me, of course. I think what made it a little hairier for me was the fact that I couldn't afford to have an accident that would stop the journey. And the only way you can really learn to ride on sand is to go quite fast over the top of it, you know. And I couldn't afford to take because I didn't know that, and I couldn't afford to take the chance. There was a really terrible corrugation on some of the roads that I was doing, and it's the same thing applies there. And that was when I learned. In the end, I had to take the chance because it was impossible to do it any other way, and I had to fly over the top of it, and it felt very dangerous.
Yes.
And I suppose it is because if you happen to have a sprightly camel leaping across the road in front of you, there's no way you can stop.
And there's no guarantee at 45, 50 miles an hour when you're skipping across the corrugations that actually the corrugations continue to be regular, are they?
Absolutely, yes. So there's an awful lot of that to learn. And the same fording rivers. I mean, that was another thing that I'd never done and absolutely had to do it because otherwise I had to go back 3,000 miles. So what I discovered was that the bike was much more permissive than I thought. You know, it could do things that I never thought a bike could do.
The bikes actually want to get it right, don't they? It's interesting, isn't it?
It could actually ride over the top of football-sized boulders and still stay upright. You know, and that was a great discovery.
One of the things with corrugations, I soon realised that if I stopped hanging onto the handlebars with the grip of death and let the bike meander a little bit as it wanted to, then they were just that much more rideable. And I felt less scared by doing that.
That sounds convincing. I don't remember ever giving it that much leeway, but I'll remember that if I ever have to do it again. The other thing, of course, was maintaining the bike. And as you say, the Triumph had needed rather more taken care of. You were on a BMW?
I was on an R80 GS from 1992.
Yes. Which is the bike that I used on the second trip. But it was really important on my first trip when I was still learning to get into the habit of looking at everything very carefully. Every time I stopped, I would go over, and there were various places, various parts of the bike, like the rocker caps that would come unscrewed, you know, for no reason at all, and things. And you had to really have an eye on everything.
Do you still do that now? I do. I get off the bike and the first thing that I do is walk around the bike and I'm looking for leaks, you know, that little bit of an oil stain in the dust or something that's shining where it shouldn't be shining and that sort of thing.
Yes, I think I'm lazier than you are now. But then I'm not looking, it's no longer my lifeline, you know. It's,
Going back to river crossings, did you walk across them first? I usually did.
No, because I would have just got wet. No, well, I'm just looking back now to 40 years, more than 40 years ago. I mean, I just remember walking up and down on the side of the river, telling myself, well, you know what, I've got no choice. I've got to do this. But I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's. You know, I really didn't think it would work. I didn't know what else I could do. I certainly couldn't. It was too deep for me to simply wheel it across. I couldn't think of doing that. So I had to really screw up my courage big time to do it. But then there were 3 more, and it just got, I began to believe that this is possible.
I used to walk across them because having fallen off in the first one that I ever tried, because there was a boulder under the water and I hadn't seen it, and I didn't hit the boulder, but on the other side of the boulder, on the one side of the boulder up current, there was a big gully that had been cut by the water hitting the boulder and then swirling around, and I hadn't realised either were there, and I just went wallop straight down. Fortunately, I managed to close the throttle quickly enough. Kill switches, they're useful things at times like that. But from that time onwards, I would always just walk across, in part because then it would give me an idea whether there were slippy stones or whether there were boulders or holes, but also it would give me an idea of the strength of the current, and therefore would I have to angle the bike upstream as I'm riding, knowing that the river was going to drag me down.
Yeah. The first ones were the big learning experience.
It is an incredibly daunting task when you're out there and you're riding solo and there's nobody else to help you if you stuff it up. You have to make it work, don't you?
That's right, yeah. The main thing was that that I was on my own. I'll just speak for myself. I think it's true for both of us. But I had to succeed. I couldn't afford for it to go wrong. And it's what most people think was odd that some people think it's odd that you should want to make a journey like that alone. But the dividend of doing it alone is enormous, partly because you learn to overcome all sorts of problems and you discover that the world actually accepts you rather than rejects you as you go along. But the other thing is that you learn so much more about yourself and about the world around you if you're alone in it than if you're with somebody else who speaks your language and talks to you, stops you from really losing yourself in this new world that you're riding through. I think
I completely agree with you. Most of my trips I've done solo. And I like travelling on my own because although potentially I'm more vulnerable because I'm my own, either to falling off and having to sort it out or in a dodgy situation or my belongings on the back of the bike at a border crossing, I'm a very positive thinker and very rarely anything actually big time goes wrong. But having the complete freedom of distraction other than the environment is quite a fine thing, isn't it?
It certainly is. It's that, and also your dealings with other people are quite different if you're on your own rather than with somebody else.
If the two of you, then you're almost like a self-contained unit, aren't you?
Yes. From the point of view of dealing with the people that you meet as you go around the world, it's really very important to be quiet and not to be a threat, to be as unthreatening as possible. One person is less threatening than two, for a start.
It creates quite a lot of suspicion, doesn't it, when there are two of you and you're speaking in your own language and nobody else understands what these strangers are talking about. It's, you can see how that would work, couldn't you?
Yes, well. And then again, what's really important, or what was terribly important for me, I discovered after the event, I didn't even realize it was happening while it was happening, was that I was being on my own and not having someone to remind me who I used to be. I found that I was changing. I was being sort of led quite gently into being a much simpler, more direct person and having a great deal more confidence in myself because it was me doing it, and people were responding to me, and I was picking up a lot of information about them as I went through. A lot of the situations are, of course, very funny because, as you know, you're coming from a distant world into a small village or a small community, and for them, you're a kind of a messenger from
the Martian has landed.
Yes, from someone extraordinary. As likely as not, they think that the places you've been are incredibly dangerous, and that the places you're thinking of going to, where are you going? I'm going to Marshall. What? You're not going to? You can't go through there.
You'll never live.
Yes, right.
The one thing that travelling on my own for as long as I have done is, on this trip, I began to realise that I was actually becoming quite selfish. because I could wake up every morning and think, what do I want to do? Do I want to take that left-hand turn? Do I want to stay here for an extra couple of days? And when I first met Birgit, it took us a while to get together and to travel together, in part because I suppose I was dragging my feet over losing the ability to be completely selfish. But actually travelling then with her opened up a completely new world. It was really nice to share things with her, even if we weren't even talking, but just sitting on the top of a mountain and looking at a fabulous view together. That sense of sharing was quite spectacular. And I did start to be less selfish. I still think I'm a bit selfish.
I think selfishness is not the word for it. I think really you shouldn't blame yourself for feeling free. I was very reluctant to do that because of the job that I'd given myself, which was to come up with a book at the end of it. And I did, in fact, travel through Australia with a girlfriend that I'd met in California. And it was a lovely experience being with her, and we were very much in love. But as a writer, I couldn't figure out how I was going to be able to write a book that incorporated suddenly being with somebody else, and not the book that I had in mind to write. It was what she called your fucking mission. And in the end, you know, I had to tell her that I couldn't go on traveling with her. So, you know, there was a different thing that stopped me from sharing it with others. But I must admit, I've never been a group rider. I've never really wanted to ride with a lot of other bikers. I find it slightly dangerous because of the way people are. You know, they get sort of in the way, and also I like to be able to stop when I feel like stopping.
I agree. I mean, one of the things about travelling with another person is, of course, you have to be prepared to make compromises, and sometimes the compromises that you end up having to make are not the ones that you actually really feel comfortable with. And the danger is you ride away from a situation feeling like you've missed out, and that's not good on a journey of exploration, is it?
Well, that's right.
It's very handy when you drop your bike and there's somebody there to help you pick it up, isn't it?
Yes, that's useful.
And from the writing side of things, I mean, I didn't intend to write books, so I was writing a journal every day.
I see.
I always think that every day you're on intake overload when you're on a journey like this, aren't you?
Do you in your normal life keep a journal? I mean, I never did.
No, if I'm doing a journey, then I do.
Yes, that was the only time that I did it. And I discovered that when I finished the journey after 4 years, and I was beginning to write the book, and I'd thought that I would be constantly reading all the notes that I'd made, and I discovered that just through having made the notes, I didn't need them anymore.
I understand that.
I remembered almost everything that I wanted to remember.
For me, I found that writing down the things that came into my mind, or observations and so on, from the day, that actually helped plant them more firmly in my mind. But also, you know, by the time I got to the end of the trip, it was 8 years. I'd forgotten a lot of things from the early days. So
8 years is too long to remember.
Yeah, exactly.
So that would be impossible. At the end of my 4 years, I could still remember where I'd spent every night of those 4 years. A third of them were on the ground, a third were in somebody else's house, and a third of them were in cheap hotels somewhere. But I could remember every one of those. But if I'd gone on any longer, I would have started to lose it. And that's why I was so getting quite impetuous at the end to get it finished. That's a shame, because I missed out on a lot of stuff that I wish I'd seen. I came through Afghanistan and could have really seen a lot of stuff that is now impossible to see.
Yes.
And I'm also, of course, really unhappy that I never went through the Middle East, because at that time would have been possible to do that.
I mean, I completely understand that. My journey was really, other than how much money have I got, how long's the visa going to last, and what's the weather doing, it was a case of, well, let's go that way and see what's down there. Africa's 5,000 miles long, and I rode 22,400 miles in the end of zigzag, because the bike meant that I had the freedom to do it, and that was nice. But Ted, I'm so glad that you did that, because Jupiter's Travels has influenced so many people's lives. I'd love to know how many, and I bet it's hundreds of thousands of people that you've actually got motorcycling and interested in reading about travelling in other countries.
Well, I hope that's true. I mean, it certainly was never my intention. I'm very glad that it's been so successful, not just because it's kept me alive, but because it has influenced a lot of people. And I dare say your books have too.
I kind of like the idea that perhaps my books will have more people thinking, well, if an idiot like that guy Manny can do this, then perhaps I could too.
I don't think that's what people are thinking at all. I think they admire what you did, and they enjoy being a part of it, as long as they're reading them. But you developed this whole idea of writing a series of books. When?
After the trip. I'd written a few magazine articles while I was going along, and I got stuck in Delhi trying to get my visa for Iran, and it took 3 months in the end to get my visa for Iran, because Maggie Thatcher was annoying the Iranians at the time. So any Brits who were going that way were having their lives made difficult. And I was in the Delhi tourist camp, and travellers swapping stories as we do, and one of the evening, one of the girls said, "Sam, so many mad things happen to you, you should try writing some magazine articles." Well, I'd got the worst possible grade of English at school that you can get and still pass, but I thought, well, why not? Let's have a go. And I sat and wrote 3 articles, sent them off to Motorcycle Sport and Leisure in the UK, and to my amazement they said yes. And then sent me a letter saying, if you feel like sending us any more at any time, then please do.
That was Peter?
His surname was Stevens. And then Peter Henshaw took over.
That was somebody else earlier.
That's right. Yes. When we got back to the UK at the end of the trip, Peter phoned me and he said, well, look, Sam, we're getting letters and emails from people saying they like your articles. They'd like to know when your book's coming out. Well, my reaction was, what book? Yes. It was the furthest thing from my mind, and I was sure I didn't have the ability to do it. But I thought, well, this will be an adventure having a go at doing it, and I may fall off and make a complete idiot of myself, but unless I try, I'll never know whether it's possible. So I spent 2 years writing into Africa, submitting it for the next 2 years to various publishing houses, and eventually people like Random House and Virgin wrote me very nice refusal letters with words to the effect of, you're not a media personality, so we won't sell enough to make it worth our while to publish them. And I was thinking, yeah, but that's the point, I'm not a media personality. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute, you can't be daunted by this. They've written you refusal letters, and so many publishers didn't even bother to do that. And they say that they like your book. Why don't I learn how to self-publish? And so that's what I did, and out came the first book a year later.
And that year would have been when?
That was 2005.
I think when I finished my journey, I had to face the fact that publishers didn't think anything to do with motorcycles was worth publishing. Except I was lucky enough that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had come out just the year before I got back. And for the first time, it was actually possible to talk about motorcycles to a publisher.
I wonder whether publishers then were a little bit afraid of motorcycling, because there was still this air of the danger and risk of mods and rockers and all of that sort of thing around, wasn't there?
It might have been that, but I think more likely it was just that they thought the only people who were interested in motorcycles were people who didn't read books. I mean, I think they thought it was a plebby sort of occupation that they shouldn't really have anything to do with. The main thing is you have to be able to convince somebody to actually read it, you know, and as soon as they'd read my book, they knew that they were going to publish it.
Because that was Penguin, wasn't it?
No, it was Hamish Hamilton.
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah, in hardback. And, you know, and again, I was lucky because I'd been a journalist, I'd been in newspapers, I knew people, and so I had sort of the kind of credibility that they like. And it wasn't until Penguin took it over that they started to call it an adventure. The cover said, a marvelous reading adventure, right? And I had never used the word adventure at any point before or during the course of the journey. And since then, adventure has become a kind of all-purpose description of anything to do with going anywhere on a bike. And I don't know, how do you feel, Sam, about the use of this word?
Well, I suppose I kind of like it because it's a word that sparks a world of possibilities in somebody's mind, and I rather like it from that point of view. But I agree with you, the word adventure tends to be rather hackneyed now.
It's very hard, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to rob people of the idea that they're having an adventure. I don't really want to do that, but I think at the same time, people have got it confused with just making a journey. It's not the same thing at all. Adventure, as I've always understood, I used to read books as a child, you know.
Boys' own adventure books.
About adventure. It implies, first of all, it implies risk. It implies something extraordinary happening. And in a way, you don't know you're going to have an adventure until the adventure happens.
Indeed.
You know, and then it will happen very surprisingly, and it may be painful. And that's an adventure. I don't like the use of it as a sales tool, and I think it diminishes the whole idea of what's possible.
I respect the guys that ride big adventure bikes and so on, or small traileys, and they go off and ride the dirt and so on, because these guys mostly have got an awful lot more skill on a motorcycle than I have. I bumble along most of the time, trying not to fall off and try to not to be a silly ass when somebody's watching.
I find that hard to believe, to be honest.
I'll tell I'm a rubbish rider. Absolutely appalling.
I'm certainly willing to admit that for myself. I know almost nothing about motorcycles, even, you know, and I have to tell people that because they come up to me and mouth off all these names and variations and things that you must do with this, that, and the other Japanese bike, or that, of which I know nothing. So I don't know anything about bikes really, except the one that I'm riding at the time, and I learned to ride on a journey where I couldn't afford to take risks. And one of the ways you learn is by taking risks. So like you, I'm a rubbish rider.
If two rubbish riders can go out and travel the world, then it just means that actually it's possible for anybody who can get free enough of responsibility, have a strong enough dream, a motorcycle that they like, and can get some loot together.
Yes, because quite honestly, anybody can do it on anything. You can do it on roller skates or a bicycle. People can actually do it on anything. And I suppose the other source of slight resentment that I have about the word adventure, as used commercially to describe machinery, is that it might lead people to think that they can only really have a serious adventure if they're on the back of an adventure motorcycle, you know, and that's nonsense.
And when people ask me, I say to them, look, one of the key criteria is you're riding a bike that you like to ride, you feel at home with, because this is going to be one of your best friends, if not your only best friend, during the whole of the journey. You don't name your bikes, do you? But I always do, because I have conversations with mine. Well, my bike certainly tells me when I've been an idiot again.
I have to admit that I've become very fond of the old bike, which is in a museum and gets trundled out every now and again. And when I see it, I feel a pang. But at the time, it was just my companion. Really, it was the only thing. I felt very comfortable sitting on it, and it did what I wanted it to do most of the time.
And mine was called Libby, that's short for Liberty, because it's what she gives me. And I tell you what, if we carry on nattering, these guys are going to run out of digital film, aren't they?
Oh, you think they'll run out of digital?
Yeah, it'd be a shocking state of affairs, wouldn't it? Ted, I've really enjoyed the chance to chat with you. It's really nice to spend time with you.
Yeah, it's very nice.